It sounds like a horror story. Monks, cloaked in silence, feasting not on bread and wine, but on the flesh of the dead. Yet buried deep in the chronicles of the Middle Ages lies a truth so unsettling it was almost erased from history. There were indeed monasteries where cannibalism became an act of devotion. Not the wild frenzy of savages, but the solemn, deliberate consumption of human remains, performed in candlelight, beneath the gaze of saints, and in the name of God. The world that created these cannibal monks was one of famine, faith, and fear. Medieval Europe was obsessed with death. Plague, war, and starvation haunted every generation. Life was short, suffering was constant, and the promise of salvation was the only comfort. In such a world, the line between the sacred and the grotesque blurred easily. The church ruled every aspect of existence, from the food people ate to the manner in which they were buried. But even within its holy walls, desperation and superstition could twist faith into something monstrous. In the early 12th century, reports began to spread across Europe of monks who refused to let their brothers be buried. When one of their own died, the brethren would gather in the candlelit silence of the refectory, their faces hollow from fasting. The body of the dead monk was laid before them, washed, wrapped, and blessed, and then, with prayers and chants, it was divided. Flesh was boiled into a broth that the others drank, believing it carried the essence of holiness. The bones were ground into powder and mixed with wine or honey, consumed as relics of sanctity. To modern ears, it sounds like madness. But in their minds, it was communion, the ultimate act of unity with their fallen brothers. They called it mumia sancta, or holy flesh. And this practice, as horrifying as it seems, wasn't born from cruelty or barbarism. It was born from faith twisted by famine. During the Dark Ages, food shortages were constant. In years of bad harvest or plague, even the church could not escape hunger. Records from monastic archives in France and Germany describe winters where monks scraped mold from their walls and boiled candle wax for nourishment. Starvation made monsters of them, but the transformation was cloaked in theology. To consume the body of a holy man was not seen as a sin, but a sacrament, an extension of the Eucharist itself. After all, if they believed bread could become Christ's flesh through divine mystery, why couldn't a brother's body carry the same sacred power? There were even stories of abbots who encouraged it. One German chronicler, writing in the 13th century, described a monastery struck by plague where the dead were not buried, but made into medicine. The monks, he said, took from the flesh of the sanctified, that their souls might not perish. It wasn't gluttony, it was ritualized salvation. What began as an act of reverence soon spread beyond the monasteries. In some towns, holy relics sold in church markets were not the bones of saints at all, but ground-up human remains gathered from plague pits and gallows. The faithful mixed this powder into wine or ointment, believing it could heal disease. The practice of eating human flesh in Europe, what historians later called medicinal cannibalism, was not confined to pagans or savages. It thrived inside Christendom itself. And it all began with the monks who believed holiness could be swallowed. Yet not all of these cannibal feasts were symbolic or desperate. Some, chillingly, were planned. In a monastery near the Rhine, a rule was whispered: to preserve the sanctity of our dead, we must take them into ourselves. They believed that burying a holy man wasted his divinity in the soil. By consuming him, they ensured his spirit remained within the order forever. In their dimly lit halls, under frescoes of angels, they drank from bowls that held their brother's remains, chanting prayers for his soul while they absorbed his body. It is said the air in those monasteries carried an unbearable sweetness, the smell of boiled flesh mixed with incense. Outside, the peasants who brought offerings to the abbey had no idea what went on behind its heavy wooden doors. To them, these were holy men, men who prayed, fasted, and healed. They never guessed the price of that holiness. By the late Middle Ages, the line between spiritual devotion and moral corruption had become almost invisible. The whispers of mumia sancta, sacred flesh, drifted from monastic cloisters into cities, courts, and apothecaries. What began as a secret ritual of starving monks slowly transformed into a trade, a theology, and an empire of bones. The monks had given it legitimacy. When famine struck, their rituals were defended by theologians as acts of divine necessity. The church hierarchy, unwilling to publicly acknowledge the grotesque, quietly tolerated it. Behind monastery walls, abbots wrote to bishops asking for dispensations to consume the remains of their fallen brothers, claiming it was an expression of brotherly love. The letters, preserved in fragments, read like confessions wrapped in devotion. "We have taken him into us," one monk wrote, "that he may not decay, nor depart from our fellowship." But hunger wasn't the only force driving these acts. Superstition had begun to merge with theology. The belief that holiness could transfer through physical matter, relics, bones, hair, even dust, gave rise to a macabre economy. By the 14th century, relic markets flourished across Europe, and among the genuine pieces of saints were impostors, the bones of the ordinary dead, and sometimes the condemned, ground into fine powder and sold as sacred. In apothecaries, this powder was mixed with wine or vinegar and sold as mumia, a curative believed to treat everything from epilepsy to the plague. Physicians prescribed it, nobles bought it, and priests blessed it. To swallow the dead was to ingest life, and all of it could be traced back to the silent rituals of starving monks who had blurred the boundary between faith and hunger. The idea of holy flesh spread far beyond the cloister. Even kings were said to partake. In France, chroniclers recorded that Henry Ivy's court kept a physician who prepared elixirs from a distilled essence of the sanctified dead. The same era saw nobles purchasing blood relics, vials of congealed human blood kept in crystal flasks and kissed during prayer. The Eucharist had been transformed from symbol to substance, and the monks who had once boiled their brothers in secret now watched their madness sanctified by the world. Yet beneath the reverence lurked horror. In the German states, famine struck again during the 15th century, and this time the monasteries became places of quiet panic. Crops failed, disease spread, and villages collapsed. Desperate peasants turned to the monks for salvation, begging for food, medicine, or blessings. But inside the abbeys, the monks themselves were starving. One chronicler described a scene so grim it reads like a vision of hell. Monks kneeling before a cauldron, praying over a boiling mass of meat that had once been one of their own. They did not sin, the chronicler insisted. They consumed sanctity. In their eyes, cannibalism was no longer desperation. It had become divine inheritance, an imitation of Christ's sacrifice, reenacted in flesh and blood. Each body devoured was another act of devotion, another layer of faith stitched into their souls. Some believed that consuming the body of a righteous man made them immune to evil, disease, or temptation. And when the Inquisition began its bloody purge of heresy, a strange hypocrisy unfolded. Monks were burning witches in the name of purity, while secretly consuming the dead in the name of piety. Europe's religious world had become a hall of mirrors. The same faith that condemned cannibalism in pagans now glorified it as spiritual absorption. Monks who partook in these rituals often claimed to have visions afterward, dreams filled with radiant light, angelic voices, or ghostly apparitions of the brothers they had eaten. To them, it was proof that the ritual worked. The dead spoke through them. But not everyone believed. There were rumors whispered from village to village of monasteries where the smell of cooking flesh never ceased. Travelers told tales of monks who had lost their humanity, men with wild eyes and bloodied lips, who prayed over bubbling pots in chambers lit by crimson glass. And when famine finally eased, some of those abbeys were mysteriously abandoned. No one knew what had happened inside, but locals avoided the ruins for centuries. They said the ground itself reeked of death. In time, the practice of ritual cannibalism faded, but its theology lived on in subtler ways. Apothecaries continued to sell mumia extracted from the bodies of executed criminals. Physicians prescribed skull powder as a cure for headaches or blood tinctures for vitality. Even the devout continued to believe that holiness or health could be consumed through flesh. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe had grown more educated, more curious, but no less grotesque. Science replaced faith, yet the appetite for the dead remained. And still, in the cold archives of forgotten monasteries, handwritten recipes survive, lists of ingredients that read like prayers mixed with madness. Boil the thigh of the saintly one in wine, 7 times blessed, one text reads. Filter the broth and drink with reverence. The cannibal monks of the Middle Ages had left behind something more terrifying than bones. They had left behind an idea that sanctity and sin could coexist, that the hunger for God could devour humanity itself. By the time Europe stepped into the Renaissance, the cannibal monks had long faded into legend. Shadows whispered about in cloisters, cautionary tales for novices. Yet the idea they unleashed, that human flesh and blood held divine or curative power, did not die with them. It merely changed its robes. Faith gave way to science, priests to physicians, and relics to remedies. The altar became the apothecary table. In the 1500s, the same elites who mocked the medieval monks for superstition began consuming human remains with a new justification: medicine. Across Europe, the belief in the healing power of the human body turned into a sophisticated industry. Powdered skulls were prescribed for migraines. Dried human blood was swallowed to treat epilepsy. Fat stripped from corpses was rendered into salves to heal wounds. And in royal courts, human remains were consumed with the same ceremony once reserved for Holy Communion. The most shocking part? This wasn't done by desperate peasants or starving friars. It was championed by the most educated minds of the age, doctors, scientists, and scholars who were shaping the dawn of modern medicine. Even men like Paracelsus, the Swiss physician hailed as a father of chemistry, promoted the use of mumia humana as a universal cure. He argued that life was a divine spark that lingered in the body after death, and consuming it could transfer that essence to the living. Apothecaries soon turned death into profit. In London, merchants imported mumia from the East, a tar-like substance scraped from the preserved bodies found in Egyptian tombs. It was believed to contain the concentrated vitality of the ancients. But when supplies dwindled, enterprising Europeans began making their own, grinding down corpses from local gallows and plague pits, packaging the powder as authentic mummy. The same monasteries that once brewed holy broth were now distilling blood tinctures. In the Holy Roman Empire, nuns sold vials of blood collected from executed criminals, claiming it could restore youth and vigor. In Germany, executioners were known to sell strips of freshly flayed skin to doctors. Some nobles even attended executions to drink the warm blood of the condemned directly from the scaffold, believing it carried the soul's final strength. The transformation was complete. What began as spiritual cannibalism had become medicinal cannibalism. The language had changed, but the appetite was the same. The body of man was still seen as sacred substance, capable of healing, purifying, and renewing. Kings themselves partook. In France, King Francis was said to carry a pouch of powdered mummy wherever he went, taking small doses to maintain his health. In England, even the royal apothecary stocked jars labeled man's grease and powder of skull. Physicians wrote solemn treatises on how to prepare these remedies, detailing the preferred age of corpses, the method of drying bones, the exact temperature to render fat. One document advised that the most virtuous dead, those who died young, violently, and in full health, made the best medicine. The trade grew so vast that grave robbing became an organized profession. Fresh corpses were stolen from cemeteries and sold to apothecaries. Priests and doctors argued over who had the right to sanctify or dissect the dead. The church tried to condemn the practice, but it was too late. The clergy themselves were consuming it. One chilling record from a Spanish monastery in the 1600s tells of a dying abbot given a holy potion made from the powdered heart of a martyred priest. The monks believed that the spirit of martyrdom would pass into him. He drank it willingly. The next morning he was dead, but his followers claimed his soul shone with divine light as he passed. It's easy to think of these people as ignorant or monstrous. But in their minds, they were merging faith and science in pursuit of immortality. The Renaissance was obsessed with the human body, its anatomy, its mystery, its divine construction. Artists painted flayed saints in glorious detail. Scientists dissected corpses in candlelit theaters. Death was not a taboo. It was an obsession. The irony is almost poetic. As Europe celebrated rebirth and enlightenment, it feasted on its own dead in secret. What the monks had done out of desperation, doctors now did out of ambition. The difference was only in the justification. The horror remained the same. And though the Church publicly condemned the practice, it never truly disappeared from its heart. Monks still whispered of relics that bled. Pilgrims still kissed shrines that contained human dust. And in cathedrals lit by the glow of stained glass, the faithful still ate the body and blood of their Savior, never questioning how thin the veil was between symbolism and appetite. By the 17th century, whispers of the old cannibal faith had become too loud to ignore. The Church, desperate to preserve its moral authority, publicly condemned the trade in human remains. Papal decrees forbade the sale of mumia humana in Catholic territories, calling it a blasphemy of the body and a theft of the grave. But in private, the same Church quietly sanctioned exceptions. For all its outrage, it could not deny one simple truth: relics still performed miracles. Every cathedral wanted its own bleeding statue, its incorrupt saint, its vial of holy blood that never dried. Pilgrims brought wealth, power, and legitimacy. And behind the miracle, there was always a body, a corpse that refused to rot, a heart that still pulsed with color, a skull that wept oil. Whether these were divine or simply natural mummification didn't matter. The faithful believed, and belief filled the Church's coffers. In monasteries, this contradiction took root again. Monks who once had renounced the body now worshipped it in all its decaying glory. They preserved the remains of their abbots in glass coffins, displaying them beneath candlelight. Some even claimed that consuming a flake of a saint's dried flesh or sipping from water that had touched a relic could cure the soul. The practice was reborn under a new name, veneration. But not everyone accepted the illusion. Enlightenment thinkers, horrified by the hypocrisy, began to expose the trade in human remains. Physicians in Paris dissected miraculous bodies and found them preserved not by divine grace, but by resin and herbs, the same substances once used in monastic cannibal rituals. In one scandalous case, a supposed saint whose body had been venerated for decades was revealed to have been soaked in wax and camphor, a crude imitation of Egyptian mummification. Still, the Church did not fully abandon its fascination. In Rome, relic markets thrived in secret. Traders sold fragments of bones, teeth, and even skin, labeled as holy remains. Some were authentic, many were not. In 1628, an Italian bishop confessed to possessing over 200 relics, many of which he suspected came from common criminals. Yet he refused to destroy them. Faith, he wrote, makes relics holy. Meanwhile, the culture of consuming the dead continued its transformation outside church walls. Wealthy nobles hired private physicians who prepared elixirs vitae, elixirs of life, made from blood and bone, now dressed in the language of science. The same old ritual, taking the body of another to preserve one's own, had simply changed costume. Yet beneath the surface of sophistication and reason, something ancient still stirred. In the shadows of Europe's catacombs, where the bones of countless monks and martyrs lined the walls, pilgrims came to pray, and sometimes to touch, taste, or secretly pocket fragments of the dead. They whispered prayers of healing and immortality, convinced that the essence of the divine could still be absorbed through the body. There were stories, too, of corpses that defied the grave. In the hills of Spain, a convent claimed to house a nun whose body never decayed. Visitors said her flesh smelled of roses, and that pilgrims who touched her hand were cured of fever. But when the convent fell into financial ruin, the nuns quietly began selling small relics, shavings from her fingernails, locks of her hair, tiny bits of dried skin wrapped in silk. These fragments made their way into apothecaries across Europe, advertised as holy remedies. And the most grotesque part? The faithful consumed them willingly. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe's obsession with sacred flesh had evolved into something stranger still, the cult of incorruptibility. Monks exhumed their dead abbots to test whether they had decayed. If the flesh remained soft, it was declared a miracle. If it didn't, the body was boiled in wine to purify the remains before display. In these macabre rituals, religion and cannibalism circled back into each other, locked in an endless dance. The Church's silence only made it worse. Its officials understood that miracles, no matter how grotesque, held power. So long as the faithful believed that flesh could be divine, the Church remained indispensable. And so quietly, the doctrine shifted again. No one spoke of eating the dead anymore, but to kiss a saint's relic, to drink from a chalice that once held his blood, to press one's lips to the mummified hand of a martyr. These became acts of grace. The language had changed. The hunger had not. What the world forgot, and what the Church never confessed, was that these rituals had roots not in sanctity, but in starvation. The first monks who consumed their brothers did so out of desperation. Centuries later, their madness was dressed in silk, crowned with candles, and called faith. By the 19th century, Europe liked to imagine it had outgrown superstition. Science ruled, factories smoked, and electricity lit the cities that had once been ruled by candlelight. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, the old hunger still lingered, hidden in the rituals of medicine, in royal experiments, in the quiet corners of churches where the dead still whispered to the living. Doctors in London and Paris no longer spoke of holy flesh. They spoke of vital essence. But the treatments were the same. Apothecaries sold powders labeled mumia vera Egyptiaca, true Egyptian mummy, even though most of it came from the dissecting tables of Europe's hospitals. Corpses were ground down, bottled, and shipped by the ton. The rich believed it could preserve their youth. The poor believed it could cure their diseases. And, in between, physicians profited from both. Even the royal courts continued their secret fascination. In Prussia, the royal physician Johann Schroeder published a book describing the preparation of man's blood for internal use. He advised that the blood of a healthy, executed man should be drunk while still warm. For it is then, he wrote, that the soul remains strongest. In France, court physicians for Louis XIV experimented with tinctures of heart, tiny infusions made from the cardiac tissue of stillborn infants, prescribed to ease melancholy and extend life. Across the Channel, England's most respected doctors prepared a salve known as unguentum hominis, made from human fat stolen from graveyards or gallows. It was applied to wounds and fractures, believed to transfer the victim's vitality to the living. And though these practices were justified as medicine, they carried an echo of the monastery. The belief that one could absorb the spirit, the holiness, the strength of another through their flesh had never died. In the catacombs of Europe's old cities, the dead multiplied. London alone sat atop layer after layer of its ancestors. Plague victims, paupers, monks, and nobles, all buried together in pits that ran for miles beneath the streets. When new tunnels were dug, bones spilled out like confessions. In one chilling discovery beneath a church in Clerkenwell, archaeologists found hundreds of skeletons arranged with unnatural precision, skulls stacked like rosary beads, ribs woven into crosses. The monks who once tended these catacombs had vanished centuries earlier. But the arrangement suggested ritual, not chaos. It was here that the rumors of the Cannibal Monks resurfaced. Newspapers of the Victorian era, desperate for sensation, retold the legends of holy men who had eaten their dead to survive plague and famine. They painted the Middle Ages as a nightmare of superstition and decay, but the irony was lost on them. Because in their own hospitals, patients were still being treated with ground bone, dried blood, and liquefied fat. The age of reason had inherited the sins of faith. Even in the 20th century, the remnants of this morbid tradition clung to life. Pharmacists in Germany continued to sell mumia until the 1920s. Advertisements promised that the powdered flesh of the ancient dead could strengthen the heart and ward off infection. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, still displayed the incorrupt bodies of saints, their leathery skin and hollow eyes illuminated by electric light. Pilgrims kissed glass coffins, pressing their foreheads to mummified hands in search of miracles. It is said that in one monastery in Eastern Europe, a sealed cellar was discovered after World War II. Inside were rows of preserved bodies, monks seated upright at a long wooden table, as though frozen mid-prayer. Each wore a rosary, and before each lay an empty bowl. Forensic analysis revealed that the bodies had been partially cooked before death. The Church dismissed it as wartime rumor, but those who entered the chamber swore the air reeked faintly of iron and smoke. We want to believe that history moves forward, that we've escaped the madness of our ancestors. But the truth is, their obsessions still haunt us. We still worship flesh. We still chase immortality through the body, only now we call it science, surgery, or cosmetics. The same hunger drives it all, the fear of decay, the terror of death, the desperate hope that something sacred hides within the human form. The cannibal monks of the Middle Ages were not monsters. They were mirrors. In their hunger, we see our own, polished, rational, and modern, but no less desperate. They believed consuming the dead brought them closer to God. We believe dissecting the dead brings us closer to truth. The language changes. The ritual remains. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, beneath the cathedrals and hospitals and universities built atop centuries of bones, the old silence still waits. A silence thick with the memory of prayers and screams. The monks who ate in candlelight and called it communion. The doctors who bottled human blood and called it medicine. The kings who drank from skulls and called it grace. History buries its horrors, but the ground remembers. And when you walk the streets of Europe today, past the abbeys, the crypts, the plague pits, every step is an echo of what they consumed to survive. A reminder that beneath the faith and science, the temples and laboratories, we are all still haunted by the same hunger. The ancient, unholy appetite for immortality that once led men of God to eat their own.